Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Based AF. I'm sociologist Ashley Frawley. With me today, I have, back again, Roger Foley. Thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, it's not under the happiest of circumstances, though I am pleased to see you.
Okay, the Speaker has now shut the doors, which means we are about to imminently hear the result of that vote on assisted dying. And of course, the ayes are going to be people supporting this private member's bill, so supporting the principle of assisted dying. The no column is those who reject it.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 275. The ayes have it, and look! Right.
Well, there we have it.
Thank you, everybody.
MPs have voted to allow adults who are terminally ill to be provided with assistance to end their own lives. They voted in favour of the principle of assisted dying. 330 MPs voting in favour, 275 voting against. So a majority there of 55.
With the UK passing the second reading of their assisted dying bill. What was your reaction to that?
It was very devastating, and also I know a lot of people that were very devastated and sickened, quite frankly. Also on Twitter, persons with disabilities were really upset as well. And I'm not sure if a lot of people caught this, but the so-called strongest safeguards in the world, or strictest, whatever she's been saying, one of them fell, like during the debate at the last point of order. Leadbeater calls a point of order, stands up, and goes on to confess, oh, well, the judiciary doesn't actually support me.
Point of order, Kim Leadbeater, please.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I seek your guidance on correcting the record. I said in my speech I have consulted with the highest levels of judiciary and medical profession. I have received correspondence from the Judicial Office and I would like to clarify my earlier comments. Whilst I have spoken to lawyers and judges, I should not have implied that the serving judiciary has in some way indicated their agreement to the bill, which they have not. The serving judiciary have been very clear to ensure that they have made no public comments about the bill one way or the other. So, Mr. Speaker, I apologise if I applied anything to the contrary, and I seek your guidance on correcting the record.
Well, thank you for correcting the record.
So the whole debate when she's talking about the legislation and it's all high court as a safeguard, all of that wasn't true. So, I mean, that's evidence in itself that safeguards will fail.
Can you explain a little bit more about what that means? She said the judiciary doesn't support her. Why does that evidence that the safeguards will fail?
Because the bill is based on the safeguard that a high court judge would also be a safeguard to do a final approval. So if you look in the legislation, there's this huge section on the high court approval for assisted dying request. So it has to go through the first doctor, then the second doctor, then high court. And that was the big strict safeguards in the world, that no other country has this high court approval. And then at the end of the debate, 5 hours later, she raises one order at the end of it and says, oh, I don't actually have the support of the judiciary. And somehow she still held the confidence of the vote. So,
yeah, there were a lot of moments like that. Like she says, this will never be expanded. And then people were sort of saying, well, we can expand it.
Yeah,
it later.
Danny Kruger was really good at showing how weak the legislation was. So,
yeah, and it's interesting also how much outright lying there was, which I was surprised by. Why is there such a desperation to misrepresent the bill? And they're there will be limited discussion moving forward. And they kept saying, well, a vote now isn't really a vote. Yes. They're just like, they're saying whatever they had to say to get it through. And I wondered if you had a sense of why there's such a desperation behind it.
It's always like that. It was like that in Canada with C14. It was like that in New Zealand when they legalized. Um, like they they don't tell the truth. I've heard all these scripted talking points before. Um, like, oh, now that we introduced this, we're really talking about dying now. We never did before. Well, yeah, we always have. And we've always talked about how horrible palliative care and healthcare is. So why don't you improve that? Why don't we have a discussion about that? Why does it have to be the big red button that you push? Um, and like ending suffering. It's well, your healthcare system is causing suffering, and I've heard all this before in my country and in other countries, and um, it is just really, really sad that they always stoop to lying, and the public is misled. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting how they always talk about, oh, we don't really have a societal conversation about death. Well, here we're not really having a societal conversation about death, except through a sanitized, bureaucratically overseen process. It's almost like nothing happens that isn't subject to some kind of government procedure. So they're like, oh, we'll talk about death as long as it's sort of sanitized, as long as it's clean and predictable. And none of this sort of like, let's talk about the messy, unpredictable nature of death. No, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about, scaring people. And there was just like outright, they're like, someone on Twitter was saying like, oh yeah, you want people to die choking on fecal matter for 10 hours? And this palliative care nurse responded saying, this is not even physically possible. And if it were possible, we would do this and this, you know?
yeah.
But it was just like the only way that they can talk about death is when in the process of scaring people. But
Mhm.
also, I think the part of the reason behind the push to talk about it or to not talk about it is or to talk about it very quickly, as quickly as possible, is because if people think about it just that little bit more, they know they will see the problems. And so they're very political opportunists. Whenever something like this happens, it's on the agenda in so many different countries all at the same time. You know that there is a lobby, there's some kind of international lobby that is looking for political opportunities. We call this strategic targeting in social policy. There's lobby groups, usually it's some supranational level, and they look for strategic moments of political opportunity. And so you have this new government. It's shocking actually that something like this was not in their manifesto, so people didn't vote for this, but it was a political opportunity right at the beginning of the government. So to be forgotten by the next, well, no, there'll probably be an inquiry into the horrors, but they probably think that that'll happen a few, maybe decades down the road and they'll be fine. But it's like, get this through as quickly as possible with as little debate as possible. Because as I said, if you think about it, you'll see what's happening.
Yes, and also the majority that Starmer has uh, is one of the lowest voter turnouts in the history of the UK. So it was more of a vote that nobody showed up for because they were so tired of the Conservative Party. And so he's been in power for about 4 months and he's already really unpopular where there's a petition to have an early election. That's not going to happen, of course, but it shows that the sentiment is that the UK, they really feel they made a mistake. But because of the way the House is and majority is, are stuck with him for 4 years or 5. So.
Yeah, I mean, the electorate was really stuck between a rock and a hard place with this one. But I mentioned if people thought about it a little bit more, they would see what's happening. But I wanted to talk today a little bit about, well, what exactly is happening? Why is there this push? Where's this drive coming from? And, because it was so quick, and this is again a tactic, you don't have time to organize an opposition. And if you don't have organized opposition to a policy change, often that change will happen. And so any kind of groups that have tried to organize have been on the back foot. They're responding. It's already being debated, and people are like, "Oh my gosh," they're just sort of getting their bearings now. So critiques are only sort of they were trickling through in blogs and that sort of thing, but there was very little public debate, and then all of a sudden there was this vote. So journalists have just started pulling up some of the origins of the lobbying. And I was doing the same thing. And some of the things that I found were a bit disturbing. So I'm not the only one who's noticed this, but there are climate change lobby groups that have long been interested in sort of, lowering population, this sort of thing. Obviously you have people who are very zealously, individual activists who are very zealously in favor of changing the law because of their own personal experiences, that sort of thing. But I think that's the least sort of important aspect. That's sort of the front line, but the organized groups are coming from a lot of different areas. There's the odd sort of unashamed insurance company that just outright says, "Hey, we're going to have a crisis here if we don't start dealing with expanding euthanasia." But I do think that the underlying cultural drive is a devaluation of human life. I think that these, climate change groups, these sort of Malthusians, they were fringe. This idea of like human beings are a plague on the planet has had a lot of cultural currency, but it was pretty fringe. But it's now becoming more and more mainstream, and people are having less and less of a problem with dispensing with human life, and particularly the lives of people with disabilities and older people who are seen as like a drain on resources. What or who is behind the assisted dying movement? In a recent blog post, journalist Charlotte Gill makes some connections, albeit tenuous at this point, between the movement for assisted dying and environmental groups. For instance, she speculates that More in Common, the organization set up in Joe Cox's name, might help explain the link to Kim Leadbeater, who seemed to become invested in the issue of assisted dying overnight. More in Common was founded after the tragic murder of MP Joe Cox in 2016, and Kim Leadbeater is of course Joe Cox's sister. It was More in Common that produced a widely publicized poll claiming the UK public support assisted dying by 5-1. But More in Common, Gill points out, is not just a polling firm, and has quite lofty ambitions, aiming not just to gauge public opinion, but to influence it. Part of its purpose includes climate change initiatives, and among its funders are the European Climate Foundation and the Barrow Cadbury Trust. More on Cadbury in a moment. So, the environmental connection, while perhaps too macabre to say out loud, seems nonetheless to be in the back of many advocates' minds, if not on the front page of their mission statements or donor lists. For example, as Roger and I will talk about later in this conversation, an MA student from a UK university recently contacted him to interview him about whether it was too soon to talk about the environmental benefits of assisted dying. When Roger told me this, to say my jaw dropped is an understatement. But of course, this was just a student, and they can perhaps be forgiven for saying the quiet part out loud. What's really concerning to me is that an ethics review board approved this research. Why was the notion that people should be euthanized for the supposed good of the planet not considered ethically problematic? Never mind the idea of contacting someone who was pressured into assisted dying to talk about it. Anyway, Dignity in Dying, the leading campaign organization pushing assisted dying legislation in the UK, is itself a permutation of the older, outright eugenicist organization founded in 1935 called the Voluntary Euthanasia Legalization Society. It later became known as the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, or VES, before changing its name in 2005 to Dignity in Dying. This rebranding centralized a pivot from outright support for eugenics to headlining compassion, autonomy, and dignity. The founders of the organization, however, going back to the 1930s, have been adamant that voluntary euthanasia was not about avoidance of pain, but about ridding society of people who were a burden. And despite the name of their organization, they were also not opposed to involuntary euthanasia. One of its founders, Dr. Killick Millard, according to Canadian historian Ian Dowbiggin, was, in principle, not against the notion of euthanasia without consent, nor was he unalterably opposed to applying euthanasia for eugenic purposes to young children with mental or emotional deficiencies. An investigation by the Canary adds that Millard also celebrated the high infant mortality rates of slum dwellers because it ensured they would not threaten the quality of the race. Among the eugenics movement's early brethren was the Cadbury family. And Dignity in Dying's sister organization, an investigation by the Canary found, seems to be heavily supported by the G.W. Cadbury Trust, which was set up by members of the Cadbury family, and while they definitely do not outright say this, appears to be continuing members of that family's legacy of support for eugenics and population control going back to the 1930s, if in a different guise. Another investigation by the Canary found what it calls a gilded portfolio of elite backers for the Canadian arm of Dignity in Dying. They point out that its 2023 donor listing features companies like Google, Canadian fossil fuel firm Suncor, and life insurance company Sun Life. Incidentally, Pfizer, which they say produces the drugs recommended for use in MAID procedures in Canada, also sat among its donors, though it didn't appear in Dignity in Dying's most recent disclosure. So that's my shtick. That's sort of like an overview of what I think is going on. But I wondered what you think is happening here. Where's this? We touched on it already, but where are some of the different drives coming from in your sort of research and your experience?
In my experience, because I've experienced a lot, what I've seen in Canada, two major drivers, in addition to the ableism and the outright despisement of vulnerable persons that a lot of institutions have, is organs and money. And in Canada, we very quickly found ourselves the number one assisted dying organ donation country in the world. And that hadn't really
That's bleak.
Yeah.
But one's perspective on the ontological question will very much depend on their values. The fact that one of the medical objectives in the debate, I think, is to sort out when we can retrieve organs from donation helps us understand this values component of the ontological question. I mean, we're so invested in this dead donor rule, and I think that over time that rule has become so ingrained in the medical community that we hold it out as a foundational principle, not only a rule, but a value. And I think just as likely there are people who question that value now. And I know there's perhaps not an appetite to go there, but raising the question, is the dead donor rule even relevant? I think there are some who might want to say, as I think back to other contentious debates in the past few years and where we're going with medical assistance in dying, the best use of my organs if I'm going to receive a medically assisted death might be to not first kill me and then retrieve my organs, but to have my mode of death, as we medically consider death now, to be to retrieve my organs. And if to meet your definition of the dead donor rule, you have to consider me dead once you've first put me under and you have no intention of bringing me back, well then fine, I can accept that if those are my values. So we have these different ontological positions, and we have to figure out how we're going to sort that piece out. I think legally, yes, we do need an answer, and we're going to come to that. But of the possible solutions to our pragmatic issues, we can continue to allow physicians to decide and let the conflict go to the court.
And there's a report that came out of Quebec that is put 14% of assisted deaths in Quebec were organ donators. And then in Ontario, actually, the hospital where I'm at, when the top surgeons with the ethicists are advocating to avoid the dead donor role so that they can do euthanasia via organ donation, and that would be taking the organs from the person when they're still living. And that would be the means of how they receive assisted death. So they would take the person, put them under an anesthetic, and remove all the organs that they couldn't remove that they had a normal euthanasia with the medications and so forth. So they would take the heart and everything else. But that's been advocated. And I sent you actually a speech that the LHC ethicist gave in 2018 at a critical care conference, I believe it was. And he just started talking about, is the dead donor role even valid anymore? And he starts advocating for the dead donor role. So it slides up very quickly, and devious minds all of a sudden get devious ideas where all of a sudden it's organ donation, and then that's not enough, where it has to be euthanasia by way of organ donation. And then our Senate and the Parliamentary Budget Committee, they did a cost analysis of Bill C-14 and expanding it to C-7, and they found it healthcare cost savings as well. So money and organs have been strong drivers in Canada, and I'm not sure about other areas, but definitely here. It's been.
So I want to stress too that it's not like, oh, the euthanasia is a sinister plot to harvest organs from the living or something, but it's sort of this kind of opportunism that develops when you have a culture that doesn't really see the value of human lives, and unless they are, sort of productive or well, I don't even know. Just I can well imagine people saying, "Well, if you don't want to live anymore, make way, and why not use your organs for someone who does want to live?" There's no taboo.
And that's exactly the argument that the ethicist made. If I'm going to receive an assisted death, why kill me first and take my organs? Why not take my organs and make that the mode of my death? Like, that's exactly what they've been advocating for since 2018. And it is a devaluation of human life because they don't realize they're talking about human beings. And even though we're disabled and we're not healthy, like, we shouldn't be just used as spare parts.
So the other aspect that you mentioned is the cost savings. And I interviewed Kevin Ewell, who is formerly Canadian, sort of British critic of euthanasia and assisted dying, and he stresses that it's not simply a cynical cost saving strategy. And I would agree with this, again, in the same way that you have to have a kind of cultural ethos that doesn't really care about certain types of lives before you start saying like, well, I don't want to spend the money. Do you know what I mean? That it's not like, oh, I don't want to spend the money, so let's just off these people. It's like, you have these people who you already think don't matter, and then you're not bothered by the fact that money will be saved, and you start thinking like, well, won't this person just vacate this bed, or won't this person just, it's like make way, essentially is the argument over and over. But it is impossible to ignore that there are significant cost savings. Now, the estimate I think that you sent me was 189 million, which, is small potatoes, really, if you think about like healthcare budgets. But then you also have the broader savings in terms of community care, which is very difficult to get, any additional kind of investments, very expensive kinds of therapy for people with disabilities. And so very quickly, the resources, housing, it adds up. And in a society that doesn't really see the value, as we keep saying, of human life, you don't see the point in doing any of that. But it's worthwhile to remember that Margaret Mead said that a key aspect for humanity's, like a key sign in the anthropological record of human beings progressing, was when you started to find skeletons of humans with mended bones, which meant that even though you were not contributing to the group in the ways that you normally would, we still cared for you and carried you with us. And it's striking to me that we're losing that. And it's like, well, what's the point of giving you costly cancer care when it's only going to extend your life by like 3 years? Those 3 years are the difference between your children remembering you, having you in their living memory as opposed to photograph. But when we were talking before we started recording, you also mentioned a very interesting email exchange that you received. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was invited to participate in the study, and at first, when I received like the write-up of it, it was uh, a study about the environmental aspect of assisted dying if it was too soon to bring it up in the UK. I thought it was the environmental impact on the society in the UK, the desensitized of the nation, the dehumanizing, the toll psychologically it would take on the. So I thought it was that sort of environment. But then as I started to exchange emails, I quickly found out it was about the green environment. So ethics department approved a study to be done asking people, is it too soon to bring up the green environment aspect in the assisted dying debate in the UK? And that was the strain of palliative care on the environment and other green environment factors. And I found it very disturbing. So,
Yeah, when you first told me about this, that someone had contacted you because their study had passed ethics approval on the environmental impact of assisted dying, of euthanasia, I thought it was somebody doing a thought experiment or a reductio ad absurdum. Like, would an ethics council really pass such an obviously unethical study? But no, this person was 100% serious that there
yes,
are environmental benefits to euthanasia.
yes. And when I raised concerns, she quickly told me I wasn't the only one. And that's why she altered her study to it being before. Is it too soon to bring up this topic during the assisted dying debate in the UK? To now she changed it to, or should we not bring it up at all? And I was, well, you should not bring it up at all. And I sent her a lot of information and research of why she should not bring it up. And then I also brought up the fact that a man named Luc Fernandez in Montreal, Quebec, brought this same thing up in about 2019 in Canada. And I can send you all the reports on him, but he brought up climate change and assisted dying in the same breath. And he there was a huge backlash. So basically, I told her, if you go down this road, be prepared to meet a backlash similar to Luke Fernandez got in Montreal, Quebec. But they were hard-headed, and they still went forward with it, and I backed out of it. I couldn't. It was too disturbing. So
So just to be clear, she wanted you to be a research participant. She wanted to interview you. Is that what it was?
yeah, it was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, an interview and a number of questions, um, and yeah, I just didn't feel comfortable with the subject matter and the positioning of it, and um, it was
No, yeah.
disturbing. Yeah.
Completely obviously understandable and actually unbelievable that she even came to you to ask you to participate in that research. But you know what I would have said? I would have said, yes, you should say this openly and widely.
Mhm.
Don't hide it. Don't hide what you're thinking. Tell the world what you're really thinking. Say it out loud, what is in a lot of people's minds who've lost their moral compass. I always say, like, I don't want racists to have to hide and go underground. I want them to say loudly exactly what they think. I don't want to have to interpret and figure it out and read between the lines. I want to know exactly what they think, which is why, I was joking about insurance companies and their involvement in this and their open advocacy for euthanasia on the basis of like unaffordable um, social care. What an incredible saving that is, but also in terms of um, covering more costly forms of care at the end of life. Those people who stubbornly refuse to accept the inevitable, which, by the way, is a core aspect of progress, human beings rejecting fate. But I actually appreciate them doing that. I appreciate that they didn't. I was like, wow, without even the decency of a front group, you have insurance companies openly taking part in lobbying. There was just a conference a little while ago, a few people that are against MAID. I'm in a sort of WhatsApp group, and they were all at this conference, and they were sort of live texting to each other. Oh my God, there's an insurance person in my breakout group talking about this. I'm glad. I'm glad for that. It's very hard actually to find the climate connections here. You have to like read between the lines and see who's connected to who and what front groups are actually a part of. So what front groups are a part of and where the money's actually coming from. Which doesn't mean to say that this is all funded by dark money. People really mean what they're saying. They really think human beings are just mouths to feed.
Yeah, and it it is beneficial to see who they are up front instead of them concealing what they're doing behind the scenes. And speaking of U.S. insurance, insurance companies in general, but in the U.S., because the assisted dying bill in the UK, they claim they're going for the Oregon type of model. And in Oregon, I don't know if you ever heard the situations of Barbara Wagner and Randy Straub in Oregon, who got letters from their insurance company offering them assisted suicide. Uh, Barbara Wagner actually was one of the first in Oregon to make huge headlines of what the insurance company was trying to talk her into. And it's happened in California too, with Stephanie Packer and a number of others. But there is a push with insurance companies um, for assisted suicide and euthanasia. And another thing in the UK debate that I think Danny Kruger put forward very well was the twisting of the language, because if you notice, he started to call the bill actually what it was, assisted suicide bill, and a point of order was raised, and I forget the name of the MP, but she told him to watch his language, and he quickly told her, and the House agreed. Well, this is going to amend the Suicide Act. This is an assisted suicide bill. So also with their lies and manipulation, they also use altered language to make it seem not what it is. And
And if members think that it's far-fetched, that's what happens everywhere else, that assisted suicide is legal, including in Oregon.
Catherine Eccles, point of order.
He's using the incorrect language. It's not suicide. That's offensive. Please correct your language, Mr.
That's got a point of order, Danny.
I'm grateful for I'm afraid to say, and I'm sorry if offence is given, the fact is that the value of actually having a bill in black and white is that we do need to see what the law really is. And what this bill would do, it would amend the Suicide Act of 1961. It will allow people to assist with a suicide for the first time. So I'm afraid that is, I mean, I respect the Honourable Lady's concerns there, but I'm afraid we do have to use the proper language here.
Do you have a sense of why? Why can't they just say what it is? This is about suicide. Especially here, because it is about the person actually has to ingest the poison.
yeah, or the contraction, like pressing. They set up an IV for the person to push. They do that in Canada too. Like in Canada, we have euthanasia and assisted suicide. The assisted suicide is used a lot less because the euthanasia is so quick, and somebody does it for them. But it exists here, and Danny Kruger also mentioned that safeguards would fall because there would be either human rights suits or lawsuits that would challenge the safeguards and restrictions, and so the eligibility would expand very quick. And one thing in the United States, if you want to talk about the Oregon and California models, the only thing that has stopped euthanasia in the States is the American with Disabilities Act. There have been so many assisted suicide pro euthanasia organizations trying to sue the state of California. But so far, the American with Disability Act has stopped that expansion in the courts. In the UK, I don't know how the legal framework is, but I don't know if they have something as strong as the American with Disability Act. So with Leadbeater's bill, all it would take is a court challenge in the UK and some judge to rule that those who aren't able to ingest it themselves or press a button on contraction, they're being discriminated against, so the bill has to be expanded to euthanasia. And that's what they've been trying in Oregon and California, but it hasn't happened. But in the UK, that's another thing that would slide pretty fast. So.
Yeah, that is one of the claims that Miro Griffiths makes, a disabled anti-euthanasia advocate or critic in the UK. That is the point that he makes, that if you are going to legalize this, you should understand that you are legalizing it for everyone. Because as soon as you talk about, they talk about the right to die, as soon as you make something a right, then if you have a limitation, then you are denying other people a right. And that is how it winds up expanding. And they know that. The advocates absolutely know that. And this is why I don't like the argument about the slippery slope. It makes it sound like, oops, oh, well, as a society, we're just like, oh, it's eroding. No, it is a conscious strategy. Advocates want a permissive assisted dying law. That's what they want. And you can tell this because they slip up all the time when they speak on the radio or on television. They talk about cases that would not be allowed as euthanasia cases under the current laws that they are advocating for. And then as soon as the first law is passed, they don't just disband. Oh, we've done what we've come to do. No, they continue advocacy. And a very interesting case is Luxembourg, where you'd think that euthanasia advocates would bring this up as a success, because they always say, oh, it's going to be something very rare. Don't worry. It's not going to change anything here. It's just for people at the very, very end of life. It's for extreme suffering and in extreme circumstances. Well, in Luxembourg, it actually is that. There are very few people actually take it up. And advocates there are complaining about that. They're saying, why are so few people taking this up? Oh, we must have the societal fear of death. Well, that's interesting. Clearly you don't, because most people are dying the normal way. But no, because for them, death only exists when it happens in this like clean, sanitized, bureaucratic, planned framework. They're like, well, we have to get more people to take this up. They're very, very clearly advocating for more people to take up euthanasia.
Oh, also New Zealand, David Seymour, the MP who originally had the original legislation passed, only a year after it became law, he admitted in press conferences he wanted it expanded, and that he always had in mind expansion when he was passing the bill. So it's always in the mind of those writing the legislation that it's going to expand. And you can see that in the UK bill, where the language is very vague. And when you have very vague legislation, you don't need amendments to expand it. The vague language already does.
And then just on this point about language that you mentioned earlier, why do you think there is this desperation not to say the word suicide, not to mention killing? Why did, there was an article in Compact that drew attention to Leadbeater's bristling and like clear grimacing throughout the whole thing anytime anyone said suicide. Why that discomfort with those words?
In the United States, I did a number of surveys. This was around the time of Kevorkian and a little bit after, but they would ask the same question 2 different ways, using the real language and then using the gas language. So it was asking about assisted suicide and euthanasia, and the public would be majority opposed to it. And then the other was assisted dying with compassion and all these romantic terms. And the public would say, oh, well, that sounds safe and logical. So it's this whole trap for the public to be duped and not actually know what it really is, to dress something up as a Trojan horse to get that in, and once it's legalized, to you just aren't able to control it. And it's all about keeping that soft language and not really communicating what it really is, so that the public perception is, oh, okay, that makes sense and it sounds really, really safe. But then when they find out what it actually is, then the narrative starts to fall apart, and people start realizing, well, we're in trouble. Kind of like what's happening in Canada right now, where they used medical assistance in dying made for short. So people didn't really draw that connection. Assisted suicide, euthanasia. It was dressed up as compassion and but now in Canada, domestically, even though our press doesn't cover it a lot, they cover more cases than they used to, but there is more and more public awareness that we've passed something that is out of control and it's doing damage. Internationally, the international media has picked up more of what's happening in Canada, but that original narrative about 10 years ago, that's fallen apart. And even people I know that are that were really sold on it, now they realize this shouldn't be legal. And that's um it's unfortunate so much havoc and damage and harm has had to happen to this point. But it just shows that the human race is not mature enough for a euthanasia or suicide regime. We're not, and I don't think we ever will be. So
I always say, in order for assisted suicide to work, you would have to have a society that values human life, that sees human life as the most precious thing. I talked about this with Kevin Ewell, where he said the only argument by the euthanasia advocates that he finds compelling is the idea of making a sort of pill or form of suicide widely available and easily accessible, so that there's no bureaucratic process that would really actually enable autonomy. But at the same time, this would be a horrific society I wouldn't want to live in. Um, and I would hope, if we ever had such a thing, society would value life so much, it would dedicate absolutely everything to ensuring they never got used. That would be instead what winds up happening is you have this availability, you have a sort of rubber stamp system, and it becomes, this is great. This is a really great thing. It's all about your autonomy, and this is something to be celebrated. You have to have a stigma around suicide. Anthropologists have been describing for 100 years at least, the taboos and stigmas that all cultures have around death. And the reason is because it is a profoundly jarring thing. It is an incredible, no man is an island, right? All human beings are connected to each other. The death of one person affects us all. And having a taboo surrounding death is an important thing because it protects it from ever becoming something mundane, something that has the potential to create such rupture, has a powerful aversion to it for that reason. And to use all this language, which destigmatizes suicide, but not by confronting it directly, but by transforming it into something else, is a form of normalization. And normalization is not neutral. To say that something is normal is to say that it's good. This is Ian Hacking, The Taming of Chance. He says, when you say make me normal, an orthodontist makes teeth straight, straight, makes them right, makes them better, makes them good, So there's this, that stigma is disappearing. And we forget that stigma was there for a reason. But do you think it's, yeah, sorry.
Oh, and the topic of normalization, that also goes into the methods that get more extreme as well. I'm not sure if you've been following the sarcopod news, but they did their first sarcopod assisted suicide, and it didn't work on the woman in the pod, and they actively had to strangle her after. It's coming out in the media. And there's a long article by journalists detailing that whole time period. And I think it's Philip Nitsky, is it? I think it's Nitsky. Anyways, he's on the smartphone. The doctor operating the sarcopod is operating the gas for it, and he's telling Nitsky, yeah, I think she's dead, and then she's not, and it just they took things so far in the extreme, and now if you look up the case, it's so disturbing, and they still want to go forward with it after the first horrible attempts at it. And having a gas chamber pod to begin with is ludicrous.
Going back to some of the underlying drivers, I wondered if you could, in some of the documents that you sent me, you talk about I suppose, the sort of psychology of authority, where vulnerable individuals can become compliant to authority figures, especially in medical contexts. Could you give me a little bit more detail about that, about this idea of how euthanasia assisted dying actually happens in a medical context, how it's brought up, and some of the problems with this?
Well, I think it's Dr. Zimbardo. He headed the Stanford prison experiment. Very brilliant man. He recently passed away, unfortunately, but um, he also studied the Milgram experiment before, and that was the shock experiment where they took someone and they made one person shock the other and keep increasing the shock. And of course, one was an actor and one was a real person. And they wanted to see how far the real person would take orders from authority, even though it was causing harm. And they would have the other person in the other room have a heart attack and still get the real person to shock them. But in Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect, he goes through a lot of the experience back then of the psychology of authority, and one was in a hospital setting where they did it with unsuspecting nurses. So they made a fake medication with a prescription limit of a certain dose, and if you went over that dose, it was fatal. So they would have a doctor call in, and they would tell the nurse to administer about 2 tons of dose. I forget exactly what it was, but it's in his book. And out of 25 nurses, it was about 23 or 24 that gave the fatal doses just off the doctor calling in and saying, I'm on my way to the hospital. I'm not going to be there for a bit, but before I get there, I want you to give this dose of this med to this patient. And on their statistics, they would see it's a fatal dose. Only about 1 or 2 nurses questioned the doctor and refused to give it, where the others just gave it. And it was a placebo because it was a study. But it shows that the psychology of authority is that people will always follow orders to do horrible things to other people, even though they know it's horrible and wrong, like in the various experiments. Some are genuinely really, really, really good people that will not do it, but the majority of humans will fall victim to psychology of authority and will become desensitized, and then they end up um, getting really involved in it, like in the Stanford prison experiment where the students who were the guards got really carried away in a role. And the ones who were prisoners became very submissive, and the ones who stood up for themselves would go through torture, and that would make everyone else more submissive. So disabled persons with the authority pushing things on them become submissive after a while. So
Yeah. This worries me in countries like Greece, where there's, in other cultures, you have like the patients' rights movement, that sort of thing, where people are more willing to advocate for themselves, but not always. And there's also a dark side to this too. But in Greece, I was just shocked about how that just does not exist. Like my pediatrician for my daughter was telling me stuff that I knew was 20 years out of date. And I was annoyed by this, and I said it to my mother-in-law, and she looked at me like I was insane. Like, "I know you got a PhD and stuff, but you're not a medical doctor. How dare you question this medical doctor?" I was like, "Yeah, but she's demonstrably wrong." Like, I know
yeah.
this stuff. Anyway, but, they it's just like, well, this is what the doctor says. And it scares me when you have that. And it's not like everybody in Canada is advocating for themselves. No, you've got people in the middle class that are used to advocating for themselves. And then you have people in lower classes who are like, or in different cultures or who struggle with English and all sorts of things. They're just like, okay, well, this person in authority is telling me this is the pathway that I'm supposed to take, that there's no more treatment options for me. You never know, there might be, as I told the story in the previous podcast of, if my dad was, in a lower class or didn't have daughters who were highly educated, he would have just accepted what they said. He was never told about the treatment that he ultimately got. And he's one of, I think, only 10 people in Canada that have ever received this treatment. And he only got it because we put the fear of God in them. We're like, oh, did you not offer this treatment because he's Indigenous? Is that it's just, oh shit.
And unfortunately, it's like that. Like
Mm.
with my situation and the home care, if it wasn't for me taking the initiative to find out things that they didn't even know, I would have ended up a casualty a long time ago. And in the healthcare system, it's agreements under duress, and it's always them trying to pull one over on vulnerable persons. It's constant, oh, gotcha, you fell for this, got you. It's never honest. It's always psychological coercion and hiding facts and distorting. And there is a lot of psychology of authority because the coordinators tell the lower nurses or PSWs things that aren't true about the patient, and to get the patient to agree to do this and hide the other option from them. So, um, yeah, like there's treatments and supports that unfortunately vulnerable persons never found out about that they should have. And
Mhm.
um,
Yeah. And as you say, there are good people, right? It's not like every single person in the healthcare system is like, waiting to poison a patient or whatever. But the thing so what you're describing from a psychological lens, I usually put from a more philosophical and I think culturally situated perspective. If you know anything about my work, when someone says human nature, I'm like, I start twitching. But from my perspective, a similar kind of idea is sort of Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil, right? So that's how she explains that it's just like people sort of default to blind rule following, which for most of human history was fine. But now we're in a situation where you have to exercise judgment because you don't know what kind of evil you might find yourself sort of wound up in. But we also have a situation where like all of our old rules are fading away, our traditions, our values, that sort of thing, and we just feel ourselves like floating about. And this leads to this desire to kind of codify morality, like use law. This is wrong. Government, tell me that it's wrong. And people, whenever you raise something, you're like, this is wrong. People go, oh, well, it's legal. Like, okay, yeah, that's not your substitute morality, I hope. Like, there's lots of stuff the governments do there throughout history that are terrible, right? But when something is then allowed and permissible by the government, that's your invitation to, forget about your judgment. So that makes it even more dangerous when it's like, well, no, this is allowed. This is allowed. And that's the banality of evil. There's all sorts
yeah,
of horrible stories where people do things and they go, well, this is allowed. And you're like, well, yeah, but it's wrong and you should exercise your judgment. And it's like, oh, like it's some foreign concept.
yeah, yeah. And then we found out that it was actually wrong and we make laws to prohibit it. And then we think, oh, well, we've really evolved. And there's a lot of things that we're doing worse now than we did before. And you're right, like losing morals, losing our ethical compass. Uh, it And especially now with how fast-paced technology is happening, we have to be really careful that we're not doing even more harm to ourselves than we already are. So,
Mhm. Yeah, one thing that I wanted to mention earlier when you were saying that so many people who were sort of passé about it 10 years ago in Canada saw what was happening and changed their minds, but by then it's too late. And I think advocates know that because there's a very good paper whose title is something like "Once Joined in Law, Let No Man." I can't remember. It's a play on the whole thing of marriage, right? Like once you're joined, let no man part you or whatever. But there's a paper that says that, and it's a very good point because once something is in law, there's no going back. The tendency is to expand. And there's definitely not a tendency to outlaw it after that point. Like a seismic shift needs to happen once you've legalized something to then prohibit it again. So I think that's why they want to get their foot in the door because they know the law is the end of it. Now in Canada, you're stuck. You're stuck. There's no
Yeah,
going back.
I don't know what's gonna happen. There, I think will be a change in government soon, and I'm pretty sure that they'll stop the expansion to mental health,
Mhm.
and they'll stop the talk of mature minors and so forth. Uh, I really it, to reverse course, you're also then the ones who have been doing it for so long, so intense, and been in such denial. Um, all of a sudden, to get them to stop, and for them to even realize, which I don't think they will, they'll probably try to move to Belgium or another country to continue. But um, you're right. The whole thing is get some form of it legalized and expand from there. And
Mhm.
that's why Leadbeater, in her speech during the debate in our opening, was saying this is not similar to Canada. This is not similar to Belgium. She wanted to set that out. But that's a Trojan horse because this bill comes in, it will eventually become like Canada and Belgium.
Mhm.
Um, and there won't be anything that the UK could do to stop it. It might be slower, it might be faster, but you like take it back to what's happening in the States as well. Maybe somewhere down the road, these hemlock societies and so forth will find a way to subvert the American with Disability Act, and then all of a sudden you'll have euthanasia in the States. Um, so it's it might reverse course. Maybe one country will identify um, and reverse course, and it will be remembered as a huge stain, rightfully so, and a mistake not to be repeated. But I don't know if that's coming anytime soon. I don't know if any leaders have the guts to do it.
Yeah. Even Kemi Badenoch in the UK had very lukewarm um critiques of the bill. She was like, "Well, I support it, but look what." And then people think of reform as like a voice against the establishment. They were all in favor, so it's really scary. So the bill's now passed its second reading. What do you think is going to happen next? Is there anything that can be done to stop it now?
Well, it's in the committee phase, so
Mhm.
you're going to hear a lot of voices, a lot of testimonies. The most important thing, I think, from experience of seeing this in my country and other countries, it's really important during the committee phase to call out flat out lies and junk science because they're going to have doctors and researchers come with their junk science papers and say, oh, here are these stats, and it can be safeguard well and everything. And one argument I hear a lot that is a ludicrous argument, and if any committee is worth its salt, like it would be called out in a second, but I don't know if it will. They will say, "Well, oh, look in Switzerland, it's assisted suicide has been there for decades, and it's under control, and the stats, but it's all self-reporting. Switzerland cannot tell you how many how many assisted suicides they've had in a given year, in a decade, all time. They don't know. It's self-reporting. And we forget that in Switzerland, Dignitas was dumping urns in the waterways.
What?
A disturbing discovery linked to so-called suicide tourism. Over 40 clay urns containing ash, human remains, found by divers at the bottom of Lake Zurich in Switzerland, all bearing the insignia of one crematorium, the same one used by controversial clinic Dignitas. Claims by one former employee, Soraya Vernley, that the clinic's founder, Ludwig Minelli, had disposed of urns in this way.
He always told me that they would dissolve in the water, that they were urns made of clay. The reason why he did this was for financial reasons, because it was very expensive to send these urns to a foreign country, and he wanted to save money.
Authorities are now investigating the claims. Dignitas, which has helped over 1,000 people commit suicide legally, refusing to comment. So far, no evidence has linked the clinic with the urns, but speculation that Dignitas could be implicated remains.
Actually, that environmental study that I was telling you about, one of the things I told her, I'll forward you the email. I'm laughing because I'm in shock. Like, you wrote it like, I was like, well, if you're going to do this, like the environmental greenhouse impact, you have to put the pollution side of it. And I set out, here's all the evidence of what happened in Switzerland, where Dignitas was dumping urns into Lake Zurich
Oh my God.
that Dignitas had just been throwing in there. And
How
also,
dignified.
yeah, I
How
know, I
dignified.
know, but that's human rights. We're not mature enough for this. And in Switzerland, there's also John Hussis, who was a Canadian, and John Hussis, he had an assisted suicide in Switzerland to evade being arrested in Canada. He thought he would be, because in the early 2000s he ran underground death. Like he killed people under the guise of assisted suicide, and CBC has a documentary on it. But he told this author named Sandra Martin, who's writing a book. He told her about his underground death ring that he had in the early 2000s, and he actually wanted to get caught so he would be put on trial and it would be legalized in Canada that way. But he came out with it, and then he thought that she was gonna put the buck out sooner than later. So then he went to Switzerland, subverted their so-called safeguards, and the assessment is on the CBC documentary too. And then after he passed away, or after he committed suicide at Dignitas, the headlines in Canada, the journalists were saying he wasn't terminal, he wasn't dying, like he was really in ill health, but he did more to either evade going to jail or out of a statement.
It's interesting because one of the I actually thought that this was kind of an obscure argument, but the more that I've thought about it, the more I've considered that this is actually really concerning. There was a paper by Christopher Lyon about medical serial killing. Like, how would you know? And there's no like inquiry that happens after a death to investigate was this actually a suicide? Um, and when you think about why we've abolished the death penalty, people used to say, if even one innocent person is given the death penalty, that's enough reason to take it away. But I have heard all week people saying, well, there might be some vulnerable people that will get caught up in this. There might be some coercion going on, but that's not enough of a reason. They're literally saying like, well, you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet sometimes.
Did
And
you
it's
see the
shocking.
footage of Esther Rothen
No.
after the vote? So I don't know what TV station was, but I have the clip. I think it's her daughter, and someone call her on the smartphone and ask her like what she thought of the vote, and they're all excited because it passed. And like she was saying, oh well, now it's a committee phase, and we'll have to wait for the third vote, so I'll have to stick around for that. And then uh, they start telling her, oh well, we like want you to stay around, and then Esther goes, "Oh, now you're coercing me to stay alive. It's this whole coercion thing that they're bringing up. Now you're doing it." And then they all laugh. And that's like, it just shows the mentality. To them, it's a trophy hunt. It's not about uh it's about ideology and getting something put through. Um because they're a shining trophy that they want to get in the door. It's not anything about benefiting society or about autonomy or anything. It's about getting their way in the ideology. And that happened in Canada in our courts with Justice McLaughlin and Justice Smith and Justice Baudouin and her father, Jean Louis Baudouin. It was this obsession to legalize, and it was compassion without wisdom, and it's resulted in disaster. It's
Yeah.
very disturbing. So,
It is really disturbing. Could you tell me a little bit about how you're doing? How do you keep going? What keeps you motivated in all of this?
for me, it's the light at the end of the tunnel, and the light at the end of the tunnel is finally getting access to the home care that I need to live and live in the community. Like, I have family too. I want to see my brothers again, my mom. I have a 5-year-old niece I've never met. I want to be a supportive uncle for her. And I have goals on like I told you, the music and stuff. So, but right now I found a mechanism. It's a home care business trust. Originally, I stumbled upon a mechanism called Microbird in Canada, but the government would block funding for that. But now this home care business trust, funding for my home care could come from any source, including intellectual property in product. So I have this unreleased music album that I did over 10 years ago, and my producer emailed him like a couple months ago when I found out about the microboard, and I was like, I'm gonna incorporate this microboard, and he might be able to use my unreleased album to, I don't know. And my brother is a comic book artist, so we have all these
Oh, cool.
characters and books. So right now it's getting this home care trust together, and then releasing the album, and then maybe releasing a few books and stuff, and seeing if that could fund my home care. And um but
Well,
I
if there's
just keep
anything I can do to help, would you send me some of your music and I'll play it at the end of the episode?
Sure, yeah, definitely. Maybe Limitless with Limitations, I could send you that.
That'd
'Cause
be great.
I wrote that song. We were talking a bit about, like, learning how to live with your disabilities and live with the changes in your life and with your health and body, and Limitless with Limitation is a song about becoming limitless no matter what limitations you have. So when things happen to you, cause they will, health challenges, um, losses of ability, and so forth, the goal you can still have goals and your life can still be good, but you just have to take alternate pathways there. And it's like me, I'm in the hospital bed. I'm fighting for my life in a system that doesn't want me to be around and blocks me every step of the way. But I'm like, still have dreams and goals. And if I can just gain access to the home care I need, and I think I can still volunteer for charities and still do philanthropy, still do arts and entertainment, and still be a part of the community, a part of my friends and family. So I can't be the Roger I was 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but I can be the Roger I am now. No matter how limited, I can still be limitless in achieving the goals and passions that I have for myself and others.
Thank you so much for joining me and for taking so much time to speak with me. I really appreciate it. And if anyone wants to donate to you, where can they go?
They can go to helprogerfoley.com. It redirects to my GoFundMe page. It will really help me out in my legal fees to incorporate the home care trust. And also, I'm still, my legal case in courts is still active. I'm in the Court of Appeal right now for Ontario. So I still have my legal action against the hospital, government, and their system partners like Ontario Health and such. I'm still fighting for my life in the courts and then also trying to establish this home care trust that might save my life in a year. So
Limitless with limitations. Oh, limitless with limitations. That we are limited. We can make anything happen. Yeah, limitless with limitations. Though I am limited, I can make anything happen. We may suffer from heavy self-doubt. We fight so much negative it makes us want to shout. But did you know this secret, my friends? All is achieved if you see it to the end.
Take a picture with your camera. Take a picture of me. Let our passion inspire you to change the whole world you see.
Take a pose of excellence and positivity. Limitless with limitations. That we are limited. We can make anything happen. Oh, limitless with limitations. With your will, you can bet the universe stop thinking you suffer from a hefty curse. No chance to win if you quit all the never give up, always keep the hope.
Take a picture with your camera. Take a picture of me. Let our passion inspire you to change the whole world you see. Stories of excellence and positivity.
Ooh, limitless with limitations, that we are limited. We can make anything happen. Yeah, limitless with limitations.